In the history of warfare, there are defeats, and there are executions. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BC falls into the latter category. Over 80,000 proud Roman soldiers marched onto the battlefield. They brought with them the absolute power of an empire, certain they were about to crush the monster Hannibal under their marching boots. But just a few hours later, that very colossal formation transformed into a deadly trap. Tens of thousands of soldiers were squeezed so tightly together that they couldn't even raise their arms to swing their swords. The front ranks, pushed back, slammed directly into the ranks behind them. Both flanks were locked tight by walls of steel, and behind them, Carthaginian cavalry ruthlessly slammed shut the final door of hope. Cannae wasn't a place where Rome was simply defeated. It was a place where they were caged, suffocated, and wiped out layer by layer. So how did Hannibal, with an army of barely 50,000 men, manage to manipulate and turn Rome's greatest strength into their very own death sentence? The secret to the most perfect meat grinder in history didn't lie in the point of a sword or a spear. It began on a political chessboard, where blinding pride caused Rome to manually hand the keys to hell to their enemy.
Before stepping into the Cannae noose, Rome had been pushed to the brink of panic by Hannibal following a string of disastrous defeats. To stop the bleeding, the Senate decided to grant emergency powers to Fabius Maximus, a dictator in the true legal sense of the Roman Republic, a man holding absolute emergency power in a time of dire crisis, not a tyrant in the modern sense. Fabius deployed a brilliant but incredibly bitter strategy: delaying. He shadowed Hannibal like a ghost, but absolutely refused direct engagement, aiming to starve and drain the enemy's strength. But Hannibal understood the Republic's weakness all too well. If Rome continued to dodge battle, their allies on the Italian peninsula would perceive their weakness. If Rome couldn't protect their allies' lands, these city-states would turn their backs and open their gates to Carthage. Furthermore, the delaying strategy was a dagger straight to the pride of the Roman aristocracy. They couldn't stomach the idea of a mighty empire hiding like cowards from an invader. And then, Hannibal made a move that forced Rome to drop the mask. In the spring of 216 BC, he marched to Cannae and seized it. Hannibal didn't choose Cannae by chance. This was a massive logistical hub containing the grain and vital supplies for the entire region. By sitting right on top of Rome's lifeline, Hannibal didn't just steal their food, he slapped their political prestige right in the face. Rome could no longer turn a blind eye. Fueled by fury and a thirst for revenge, Rome discarded the delaying tactic. They mobilized an unprecedented force, bringing over 80,000 combat-ready troops to the field of Cannae, a colossal number, more than enough to crush Hannibal's army of fewer than 50,000 men. But their command system dug its own grave. This massive army was placed under the joint command of two newly elected consuls, Aemilius Paulus and Terentius Varro. They were two polar opposites. Paulus was a seasoned veteran who immediately smelled a trap when he saw the open, flat terrain, which was far too perfect for Hannibal's cavalry. Varro, on the other hand, was an aggressive glory seeker representing the fury of the mob. Handing 80,000 men to these two generals was like letting two men drive the same car. One wants to slam on the brakes, the other is just waiting to stomp on the gas. The absurdity reached its peak when Roman law dictated they must alternate command every single day. The old fox Hannibal knew perfectly well that Paulus would never take the bait, so he simply waited patiently. He waited for August 2nd, the day the steering wheel was handed to the bloodthirsty Varro. That morning, Varro looked over at the field, saw a thin, fragile enemy formation, and was convinced that glory was calling. But the Roman general had no idea that what he was seeing was exactly what Hannibal allowed him to see.
Stepping onto the battlefield, Hannibal immediately proved why he was the West's greatest nightmare. He didn't just command troops, he manipulated space itself. Hannibal firmly anchored his left flank on the Aufidus River to prevent Roman cavalry from outflanking him. Furthermore, according to the historian Livy, Hannibal aligned his army to fully exploit the Vulturnus wind. This dry southeasterly wind whipped up blinding clouds of dust, blowing it straight into the faces of tens of thousands of Roman soldiers. Their vision was restricted before a single sword was even drawn. On the other side, General Varro decided to play a pure game of brute force. He packed his 80,000-plus infantry into an incredibly tight, dense block, far deeper than it was wide. Varro's intent was crystal clear. He wanted to use this infantry block as a colossal sledgehammer, relying on sheer physical weight to smash and pierce through the enemy's center before the Carthaginian cavalry could do any real damage. But Hannibal didn't form a straight line to take the hit. He pushed his center forward, shaping it into a crescent moon. What was the craziest part? Hannibal deliberately placed his weakest and most unreliable forces, the Gallic and Iberian warriors, right at that bulging center. To ensure these men didn't break and run before the terrifying Roman pressure, Hannibal and his brother Mago drew their swords and stood right on the front line with them. The presence of their commander was the ultimate shot of adrenaline, keeping the center from collapsing too soon. But the crescent was actually just the bait. The real blades were hidden at the two edges of the crescent. There, Hannibal positioned his most elite forces, the heavy Libyan infantry. The chilling part was that they were wearing the armor and shields looted from the corpses of Roman soldiers in previous battles. Standing perfectly still in the dust clouds whipped up by the Vulturnus wind, these butchers were practically invisible to the enemy's eyes. The guillotine was set. Rome had overwhelming infantry, but Hannibal held the decisive weapons of the battle, superior cavalry on the wings and a perfect spatial trap. 80,000 Roman soldiers roared and charged forward. Blinded by their lust for victory in the swirling dust, the massive infantry block slammed straight into Hannibal's crescent. They were confident their physical weight would tear the enemy's center to shreds, completely unaware that they had just placed both feet inside a coffin, and the lid was slowly shutting.
The roar of 80,000 Roman soldiers shook the earth. Convinced they would crush their opponent in a single hammer blow, they threw all their weight straight into Hannibal's crescent. Under this terrifying pressure, the Carthaginian center began to yield, shifting from a convex curve into a concave one, exactly like an opening sack. The Romans believed victory was right before their eyes. They pushed forward frantically, driving deeper and deeper. But that very bloodlust triggered a fatal physical paradox. As they were sucked deep into Hannibal's funnel, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers squeezed themselves tightly together. The troop density became so thick that their arms were pinned to their sides. They had absolutely no room left to swing a sword or hurl a javelin. Varro's colossal sledgehammer had turned itself into a paralyzed block of meat. But for the guillotine to function, Hannibal needed to completely neutralize the Roman cavalry on both wings. On the Carthaginian left, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry easily crushed the cavalry of Consul Paulus. On the opposite wing, the Carthaginians delivered a ruthless psychological blow. According to the historian Livy, around 500 Numidian cavalry threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Caught off guard, the Romans disarmed them and pushed the prisoners to their rear. Waiting for just this moment, the 500 Numidian ghosts drew short swords hidden beneath their tunics, frantically hacking and slashing the hamstrings of the Roman horses. From behind, caught in a deadly crossfire, the Italian cavalry broke, and Consul Varro cowardly fled the battlefield. The two protective links on the flanks were severed. At that exact moment, Hannibal gave the final signal. The invisible ghosts in the dust, the heavy Libyan infantry dressed in Roman armor, simultaneously pivoted 90 degrees and charged straight into the exposed flanks of the enemy. At the same time, instead of chasing the fleeing survivors, Hasdrubal's cavalry wheeled around and slammed the door right behind the Romans' backs. Over 80,000 men were locked tight in a suffocating space, unable to advance, unable to retreat, and eventually unable to breathe. The Roman cheers of victory faded, replaced by screams of utter despair, because what happened next was no longer a battle. It was an execution on an industrial scale.
It is estimated that up to 600 Roman soldiers were slaughtered every single minute. The Carthaginian wall of swords and spears systematically tightened toward the center, butchering everything in its path. Blood didn't just stain the battlefield red, it turned Cannae into a horrifying nightmare that generations of Romans would never be able to forget. But even as the cauldron reached its peak of slaughter, Hannibal displayed a chillingly cold control of the battlefield. Before the battle, Paulus had left 10,000 men at the main camp. This force had just launched a deep strike into the Carthaginian camp on the west bank of the Amphitus River. Unfazed, Hannibal personally led his cavalry across the river, crushing the assault, killing 2,000 enemies and capturing thousands more. Absolutely no hope of Roman resistance was permitted to survive. Back at the central slaughterhouse, the Roman soldiers experienced the worst moments imaginable to mankind. Many soldiers lost their minds in sheer panic. When clearing the battlefield, corpses of Romans were found who had dug holes and buried their heads in the dirt to asphyxiate themselves. But the most gruesome image, a testament to absolute despair, was when a Numidian was pulled from underneath a dead Roman, his nose and ears chewed to a bloody pulp. That Roman soldier, his arms pinned so tightly he couldn't hold a weapon, used the last ounces of strength in his dying breath to turn into a wild beast, tearing at his enemy with his bare teeth. Consul Paulus also collapsed and drew his last breath amidst the mountain of his own slaughtered men. As night fell, the battle closed. According to the records of Polybius, the Roman death toll could have reached 70,000. The historian Livy provides a lower figure of around 45,000, but regardless of the source, 20% of the total military-aged male population of the entire Roman Republic was wiped out in just a single day. The capital city of Rome went mad with fear. The Carthaginian generals urged Hannibal to march straight on Rome, but he refused, prompting the immortal words of his cavalry commander Hannibal, "You know how to gain a victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use it." Cannae proved Hannibal to be an unprecedented tactical genius, but at the same time, it exposed the strategic limits of Carthage. He won a perfect battle, but he couldn't deliver the killing blow to end the war. Rome refused to surrender, and that hesitation saved the Republic. Because among the young Roman generation that grew up under the shadow of Cannae, there was a name who would later learn Hannibal's exact lessons in manipulation to defeat him at the Battle of Zama, Scipio Africanus. And that is the full picture of the most brutal mass execution in the ancient world. What do you think about Hannibal's brilliant spatial trap? Which detail haunts you the most? The 500 Numidians faking surrender, or the absolute despair of the Roman soldiers tearing at their enemies with their teeth? And was Hannibal making a fatal mistake by not marching straight on Rome to finish the war? Leave your thoughts in the comments section so we can dissect them together. If you got goosebumps from this pinnacle of military art, don't hesitate to hit that like button, share, and subscribe to the channel to join us for our next tactical masterpieces. Until next time, see you on the battlefield.